Welcome to the series Nutrition for Whole Health, lessons on the nutrients that keep our bodies functioning optimally. I'm Thomas Lemke, registered dietitian and the clinical director of Whole Health. This installment is about carbohydrates. What is a carbohydrate? There are several answers to this simple question, depending upon the level of magnification you consider it from. I'm going to start as zoomed in as possible, and we will zoom out from there. At its most basic, a carbohydrate, or carb for short, is a molecule built out of carbon, there's your carbo, and H2O, or water, there's your hydrate. Let's consider the simple molecule sucrose, that is, what we would call table sugar, generally sourced from sugarcane or sugar beets. You can see its shape and its chemical structure on the screen there. Looking at that chemical structure, we can see that sucrose is comprised of 12 carbon atoms, 22 hydrogen atoms, and 11 oxygen atoms. Do you see how there are twice as many hydrogen atoms as there are oxygen atoms? The same is true of the water molecule H2O, 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. All carbohydrates are variations of this same theme, with greater or fewer carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms, depending upon the carbohydrate in question, bearing in mind that however many hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms there are, typically the ratio between them remains, just like water, at 2:1. Before we move on, I should note one last thing on this slide. Do you see the lines between the atoms in this molecule? Those represent stored energy that this molecule of sucrose holds, stored in the form of bonds which knit one atom of carbon to another. All carbohydrates have these as well, and that is the entire reason that our body needs them. You see, the carbohydrate glucose is required by our body for a process called cellular respiration, whereby we extract the energy from the molecule in order to fuel the processes that our biology runs on. It is a complex process chemically and mechanically, but the concept is simple. Glucose, which is comprised of 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens, goes into the cell. Oxygen that your red blood cells have provided from the supply of air that you breathe also enters the cell. Bada bing, bada boom, the carbon is carried off bound to that oxygen, now as carbon dioxide. The hydrate part of the carbohydrate is left behind as water, and the energy is extracted and stored in a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, to be used to power our bodies. So, we've learned that carbohydrates are a fuel source that our body burns for energy. Now, let's talk about the different types of carbohydrates. That's right, there are different kinds of carbohydrates, whole families in fact. This taxonomy, or organization, works like this. The first distinguishing factor is how many sugar molecules are in the carb in question. For instance, single sugar molecules like glucose, fructose, and galactose comprise the family known as monosaccharides. Carbs made up of 2 sugar molecules hooked together are called disaccharides. After that, if the carb has up to 10 sugar molecules bundled together, it is an oligosaccharide. Finally, the term polysaccharide can be applied to any carb with multiple sugar molecules bound together, but is typically reserved for starches, glycogen, and cellulose. Within those broad categories of mono, di, oligo, and polysaccharides, there are further differences between types of carbs, mostly structural in nature. We'll look at some of these a bit more closely so that you can understand how their differences are handled by your body. First, we have the 3 monosaccharides. From left to right, you have glucose, fructose, and galactose. Most viewers will know of glucose as blood sugar, and it is. It is also found in many other places besides your blood, including as combined into larger carbs, as we will see later. Fructose gets its name from fruit, where it is found in high concentrations, though it is not a fruit sugar exclusively. You've heard the name, of course, from such hits as high fructose corn syrup. Galactose is found primarily in dairy, which we'll come back to, but it is also made in plants. All larger carbohydrates are built using these monosaccharides as links in larger and larger chains. For instance, in the disaccharide camp, we have maltose on the left, which is simply two glucose molecules bonded together. Sucrose, the table sugar molecule we looked at earlier, is made from one glucose and one fructose per sucrose molecule, a 50-50 split. Finally, like sucrose and maltose, one of the two building blocks of lactose or milk sugar is glucose. What makes lactose different from sucrose is that the second molecule is galactose instead of fructose. Now, at this point, I need to note that in your intestines you only absorb monosaccharides and not larger carb molecules. So, what happens when we consume a disaccharide? Disaccharides in the diet must undergo a process whereby one monosaccharide is cleaved from the other by a system of enzymes, essentially little protein machines your body produces. Starting from the top, you'll see that maltose is cleaved by the enzyme maltase into two glucose molecules. Lactose is cleaved by the enzyme lactase into a glucose and a galactose molecule. And sucrose is cleaved by the enzyme sucrase into a glucose and a fructose molecule. As I said, without being cleaved apart, the whole lactose disaccharide will not be absorbed, but will stay in the intestines, being fermented by bacteria and drawing water into the area, which is why bloating, gas, and diarrhea are the result when someone with a lactase enzyme deficiency, which we call lactose intolerant, consumes dairy. Now, here's a question you may be asking. If we know that glucose is what is burned in cellular respiration, as we saw earlier, then we can infer what happens once the glucose is absorbed. It goes into the bloodstream to be available for cells as an energy source, hence blood sugar. But what happens to the fructose and galactose that we consume? You're correct. Your cells do not burn fructose or galactose for fuel, at least not directly. Let's address these each separately. Galactose is simple enough. It is absorbed in the small intestine and is then converted into glucose within your cells. Some of this glucose is burned for energy, while some of it is joined with other glucose units and stored as glycogen, a molecule we will touch on later. Like galactose, fructose is absorbed in the small intestine, but the route it takes from there is very different. Fructose must be moved to the liver for processing, where it is converted into one of two primary end products. One end product of fructose is glycogen, just like with galactose. And again, I will come to this polysaccharide molecule more fully in time. However, if your body already has all of the glycogen it needs, which is true for most of us, especially when we're not regularly engaging in some kind of moderately intense exercise, then fructose is instead processed into triglycerides, that is, into fatty acids. Yeah, fat. This fat then has to be packed into LDL cholesterol, the bad kind for those keeping score at home, for transport around the body, where it can be burned for energy or, more likely, placed into fat cells and stored for later. When this fat is stored in and around the liver, and with fructose-derived fat it tends to be, it contributes to fatty liver disease, metabolic syndrome, and associated high blood pressure, and the development of type 2 diabetes. To say this is undesirable is a bit of an understatement, and yet it is the inevitable result of unrestricted fructose consumption. We need to consider the implications of this. What's to be done? Do we swear off fruit? By no means. Consumption of whole fruits is unlikely to contribute to weight gain, high triglycerides, and the host of problems I just mentioned. This is because the problems with fructose are dose dependent, meaning the more you consume, the worse it gets for you. Fresh, whole fruits contain a limited amount of fructose, which is packaged with appetite-suppressing fiber and water, meaning they are hard to overeat. Furthermore, there are other non-caloric components of fruit like vitamins, minerals, and other compounds that can accelerate fat burning, and in general, act as supports for the health of your biological systems. So if whole fruit is fine, do we still have to watch out for fructose in our diet? Yes. And the worst offenders are sugary fruit juices and anything containing high fructose corn syrup. You may recall earlier when we looked at the disaccharide sucrose, or table sugar, and found that it is made of 50% glucose and 50% fructose. Well, high fructose corn syrup can be up to 55% fructose, edging out plain sugar as just that much worse in terms of its ability to load your liver up with fructose. Therefore, the advice is simple and straightforward. Consume processed foods like fruit juices and foods with added sugar in the form of sucrose or high fructose corn syrup sparingly. Your liver, your pancreas, and your BMI will thank you. Our next classification of carbohydrates is the oligosaccharides, which you'll remember from earlier are comprised of chains of 3 to 10 sugar molecules linked together. Within this category, there are two primary groups: fructooligosaccharides, or FOS for short, which are chains of fructose molecules, and galactooligosaccharides, GOS for short, which are chains of galactose molecules. What makes these so special is that human beings, by and large, do not digest them, meaning unlike digestible carbohydrates that are broken down by our enzymes and absorbed in the small intestine, these survive intact until they reach the large intestine. This is why they are also called soluble fibers. Soluble because they mix in and absorb water, like a sponge for cleaning out your digestive tract. Once they pass all the way through to the end, a portion of them are consumed by the microbes that inhabit the colon in a process called fermentation. Now, when our microbes ferment these carbs, they produce an array of chemical compounds that are beneficial to us, such as short-chain fatty acids that feed our colon cells and keep them healthy. Through mechanisms we are only beginning to understand, this operation can have beneficial effects on our blood sugar regulation within the rest of our bodies as well. Because of their role feeding our beneficial microbiome, our probiotics, these oligosaccharide molecules are sometimes referred to as prebiotics. Now, a quick caution: overeating these carbs, which are contained in the highest amounts in foods like beans, leeks, onions, asparagus, Jerusalem artichoke, and many fermented foods, can contribute to digestive upset, depending upon the nature of your unique bacterial population in your microbiome. Some people with certain bacterial compositions will encounter gas and bloating from eating these foods, especially in bulk. So make sure you're eating the amount that's right for your gut without discomfort. Oh, and sometimes oligosaccharides are added to commercial food products. So if you're feeling a little extra gassy, check the labels of the foods you're eating. Now we come to the polysaccharides. Again, these are chains of 3 or greater sugar molecules, and broadly fall into these 4 categories. We'll discuss them one by one, starting with glycogen. Glycogen, which I've mentioned several times now, is a conglomeration of glucose which we create in our bodies and store in our muscles and liver. This glycogen then provides a quick source of glucose when our supply of the sugar in our blood falls too low. In this way, when things are working the way they are supposed to, our fasting or in between meals blood sugar never reaches dangerously low levels. We only store about 400 grams of glycogen at a time, so when it runs out, which happens in states of prolonged fasting or during exercise, our bodies will respond by releasing the hormone cortisol. Cortisol, also known as the stress hormone, signals our bodies to begin the process of breaking down our proteins in order to turn them into glucose. This ensures that our blood sugar does not fall to dangerously low levels, but it comes at the cost of muscle loss. There's an additional cost to cortisol as well. When cortisol ramps up glucose production, the extra glucose that is made is then turned into fat, which cortisol ensures is primarily stored in your face, your belly, and your back. This is the reason why yo-yo dieting and too much exercise often fail to result in fat loss. Both of these methods greatly increase cortisol and contribute to more fat storage over time. Because of this, the better strategy for weight loss is to make healthier food selections and reduce the amount you eat throughout the day overall. This results in lower cortisol and better sustainability over time. When it comes to exercise, resist the urge to overdo it. Select an intensity level that is comfortable for you and your fitness level, and be consistent, but don't push yourself past the point of exhaustion. If you want advice that is more customized for and specific to you, schedule a consult with a registered dietitian or a certified personal trainer, as the case may dictate. Next on our list is cellulose, or what you might more broadly call insoluble fiber. Cellulose is known as an insoluble fiber because, like the soluble fiber we talked about earlier, it does not absorb or dissolve in water. If soluble fiber is the sponge of the GI tract, then insoluble fiber is the scouring pad, which is there to scrape out your bowels, pushing food particles further down the tract toward elimination. Cellulose is also comprised of units of glucose, but it differs from glycogen in that the way one sugar molecule is bound to the next is, well, different. Humans do not produce cellulase, the enzyme required to break this type of bond, and therefore cellulose passes through our intestines intact, but for the limited activity of the bacteria in our bowels that do use this enzyme to ferment it. This type of carbohydrate is made by plants, and certain microbes as well. In plants, it forms the cell wall, which, when many cells are bundled together, gives the plant its fibrous, woody structure. Lastly, we come to the category of starch, which is divided into the categories of amylopectin and amylose, which are almost always found together in our foods. For the purposes of this talk, I won't say much about the differences between these two, other than to note that while both are made of chains of glucose, note that the amylopectin on the left has branching chains, while amylose does not. This means that amylopectin has more surface area for your enzymes to work on in breaking it down than amylose, meaning that it will be reduced to simple sugars more quickly than amylose. As I said, both of these starches, like the rest of the polysaccharides, are made up of chains of glucose, as in the diagram before you. I want to emphasize that all starch that you consume, whether in rice, bread, potatoes, pudding, gravy, or what have you, is in fact sugar in its predigested form. Let's look at how that works. For the sake of simplicity and consistency, let's say we're eating a saltine cracker. This will apply to anything starchy, from a potato to a piece of bread to breakfast cereal to steamed rice, but we're going with a saltine cracker. When we put that cracker, made of starch, into our mouths, we salivate. Our saliva contains an enzyme called amylase. This enzyme takes amylose and amylopectin and, as you see in the graphic, starts punching disaccharide units out from the long polysaccharide chain. It chops up the starch, in other words, into maltose. Now, that maltose is sweet, unlike starch. If you hold that saltine in your mouth for 5 minutes, it will start to be sweet as the result of this reaction. You will be able to taste the maltose on your tongue. But we're not going to hold it in our mouths for that long, are we? We're going to swallow it, along with our saliva. And those amylase enzymes will continue to work as that cracker passes into our stomach. Once it moves into the small intestine, it gets another dose of amylase from the pancreas, along with the enzyme maltase. Now, each maltase unit, as we saw earlier, is what will cut the maltose in half, creating 2 glucose molecules for each. And just like that, all of the starch in that cracker has been transformed into glucose, which will then pass from the small intestine to the blood, entering circulation as blood sugar. Now that the glucose is in our blood, what happens to it? There are 3 major options. Option 1. The glucose is chained together to form the polysaccharide glycogen, which I talked about earlier, and stored in the liver and muscles for quick energy later. Option 2. If you already have plenty of glycogen, then as I mentioned earlier, your body will convert a portion of your blood glucose into fats and store them around your body for additional energy reserves. Option 3, and the one that is always happening no matter what, is that the glucose in your blood is taken into your various different types of cells to fuel them through that process of cellular respiration that we spent the first little bit of this presentation talking about. But here's the catch. When we talked about cellular respiration earlier, we started with glucose that was already inside the cell, where cellular respiration occurs. But going from the bloodstream to inside the cell is not an easy process. Glucose has to go through a channel in order to enter the cell. But that channel needs a password before it will open. And the password is insulin. Insulin is a hormone produced by your pancreas in order to ensure that your cells get the signal to let in glucose. Your body keeps a small amount circulating at all times so that your cells are able to take in glucose constantly and stay fed. When you eat a carbohydrate-containing meal, more insulin is released to address the resultant rush of glucose. In this way, your body keeps your blood glucose levels from getting too high without making them drop too low. In the condition called type 1 diabetes, the pancreas does not make insulin, meaning that the glucose channels stay closed. Without an injection of insulin, the cells will starve for lack of glucose and the person will die. In type 2 diabetes, the insulin is still present, but the receptor for the insulin is poorly responsive or insensitive. In this way, the signal from a normal amount of insulin is insufficient to open the glucose channels. To treat this, doctors prescribe drugs that increase insulin sensitivity, or they prescribe injectable insulin itself to increase the insulin signal enough to open the channels, or both. I'm going to conclude this presentation on carbohydrates by giving a crash course in blood sugar control. Let's start by viewing a normal blood sugar pattern. Say you start your day by eating a meal. That will cause blood sugar to begin to rise. And as it does, your pancreas will put out more insulin so that your cells take more in, thereby keeping the amount in your blood from peaking too high. Over time, this has the effect of dropping your blood sugar back to a lower baseline until you eat again and repeat the process. However, let's say that for one reason or another, the glucose is too much for your insulin to keep under control. This could be due to insulin insensitivity, where the insulin receptors on your cells are slow to pick up insulin's signal, or it could just be that you washed down 3 family-sized pizzas with Dr. Pepper and flooded your system with carbs. In this case, the blood sugar exceeds normal bounds and rises too high, which your pancreas desperately tries to correct by flooding your system with insulin. This in turn drops your blood glucose, causing it to dip below a healthy baseline. At this point, your body is in a panic because blood sugar dropping too low is a recipe for disaster. So to address this, your body releases 2 hormones, glucagon and cortisol. Glucagon is going to mobilize that glycogen we talked about earlier from its reservoirs in your muscles and liver to get glucose back into the bloodstream fast. Cortisol, as I also mentioned earlier, tells your body to pull proteins out of your tissues to convert into glucose, just in case your supply of glucose as glycogen is not enough. This means that you lose digestive enzymes, making your digestion weaker, and proteins from your muscles and skin as well. Not good for healthy skin and muscle. Further, your body is now screaming at you to eat because it needs you to replenish your glucose so it can get back to normal. Your body is in a state of stress. So you do the stress eating thing and reach for a tub of ice cream and the potato chips and start the roller coaster all over again. This is an abnormal glucose regulatory pattern, to be sure, but we also call it something else. The obesity-causing pattern. Let me explain. Your body burns fats and glucose for energy at the same time. The ratio, how much glucose to how much fat, varies depending upon several factors. For instance, high-intensity aerobic exercise burns an enormous amount of glucose, while fat burning is actually reduced during high-intensity cardio. Well, high insulin means the body will preferentially burn glucose because insulin is high when glucose is high, and the body needs to get that glucose under control. The extra glucose that is beyond what your cells can burn will be turned into fat. And as we saw earlier, if you throw cortisol into the mix and start to turn proteins into glucose, then much of that will simply end up as fat as well. Meaning, if you want to burn fat, mind your carbohydrate intake, or else you're going to be turning the proteins in your body well, and to fats. Same thing if you do not want to drop into diabetes type 2. Mind your carbohydrate intake because this can become a vicious cycle. But how exactly do we mind our carbohydrate intake? The main tool to use is simply to reduce your excess calorie intake from all sources, which will naturally cut down on carbohydrates along with everything else. If you want to go further, then I would recommend developing a familiarity with the concept of glycemic index, as well as a related concept called glycemic load. This is a tool that ranks foods on a scale of how much they raise your blood sugar. The higher on the scale, the more prone they are to sending your blood sugar into orbit. So, keeping your food selections out of the high category as much as possible will help keep your blood sugar under control. To find out where a food falls on the glycemic index or to get a list of common foods arranged by glycemic index, simply turn to your favorite online search engine. If you're around my age, you probably remember Saturday mornings watching cartoons, which were frequently interrupted by ads of all kinds, but most especially sugary breakfast cereals. And after all of the zany fun depicting how desirous the product was, they always closed with the same message, where they assured that the cereal was part of this balanced breakfast. Different companies might phrase it slightly differently. Part of this good breakfast, part of this nutritious breakfast, part of this complete breakfast. But despite these differences, the breakfast was always the same. A bowl of the cereal, which is a serving of grains, a piece of toast or a muffin or even a bagel, another serving of grains, a glass of orange juice, a serving of fruit, and milk, a serving of dairy. Let's do a roll call on macronutrients for that breakfast. Any protein servings in there? Not a one, beyond 8 grams that you'll get from that glass of milk. Fats? Maybe a pat of butter, or is it margarine? The milk, unless it's skim. What about carbohydrates? Let's see. The cereal is just sugar and starch, so carbs. The toast is starch, more carbs. The orange juice is full of fructose sugar. Remember that monosaccharide from earlier, more carbs. And a glass of milk has about 12 grams of lactose sugar, more carbs. Whatever this balanced breakfast means, it does not mean balanced blood sugar. In fact, this balanced breakfast of TV fame is, once all of the starches are broken down in your body, going to contain approximately 31 teaspoons of sugar. Compare this to the breakfast on the right, which contains only 3 teaspoons, 1/10, the sugar, even without cutting calories. Now, weight loss is unlikely to be achieved without cutting calories, but as we've seen, it is next to impossible to achieve without cutting overall carbohydrates, whether by cutting overall intake or selectively reducing your total carbs at each meal throughout the day. That way, you can take this to this. Now, make no mistake, carbohydrates are still an essential component of any healthy diet. By understanding what they are and how they work in your body, you are now equipped to make better carbohydrate choices for your health and for your life. Thanks for watching the carbohydrate installment of the series, Nutrition for Whole Health. We'll see you around.